Thank you so much. I absolutely want to add my thanks to Andy's for the support you show for Earth Journal and for MinnPost. And thanks for coming out tonight for what I think promises to be a really terrific program. I also want to thank the Hell's Kitchen folks for hosting us so well and taking care of us so well. And I've seen a few faces or names in the crowd that are actively engaged on pollinator issues. I think I saw Erin Rupp, who recently moved from, there she is, from her work as an educator in the honey business to starting a new nonprofit, Pollinate Minnesota. I have an idea some folks from the Department of Agriculture may be in the house. So there could be some networking opportunities out there tonight, in addition to our exciting program. You know, for those of you who follow the plight of bees and other pollinators, our guest tonight really needs no introduction. But for the others, and just because it's good manners, I'm going to say just a few words about the work and particularly the influence of Dr. Marla Spivak. Marla's been interested in bees for nearly 40 years, beginning with her work for a commercial beekeeper in New Mexico and proceeding through decades now of internationally recognized scholarship. She came to the University of Minnesota in 1983 and today is Distinguished McKnight Professor in the Department of Entomology, as well as Director of its Bee Lab, where effort is focused on improving the population health of these important pollinators through a wide range of practical, solutions-oriented research. In 2010, she was honored with a MacArthur Grant. That's the one the morning paper always refers to accurately as a Genius Award. And on Sunday, I did a quick Google search for Marla's first and last name, plus a mention of either bees or pollinators. And I came up with 11,200 hits. I didn't inspect them all, but I went through several hundred. All of them were about her, and most of them were from the last few years. That may be a crude measure of influence, I grant you, but show me something better. Don't do it now, but try that search when you're at home. And for example, you'll see her TED Talk from September 2013, her interviews on CNN, NPR, and PRX. References to her research at an amazingly diverse swath of government and nonprofit policy sites, coverage of her policy views in publications from Permaculture News and Ag Review to the New York Times, the Star Tribune, and not least our own MinnPost. I am willing to speculate, though I can't prove it, that Marla has done more than any other authority in this field to broaden the discussion of bee health beyond the problems of commercial honeybee operations, which dominate the headlines and are indeed significant, but comprise only a part of the trouble we seem to be in. And tonight she's here to talk with us. I think she's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to take your questions, and we're going to do that a little bit differently this year. There are little index cards on your tables on which you can write out your questions. And as soon as you do, please hold them up. We have two folks, Bethany and Sally, who will gather them for you and bring them to the stage. And I'll ask your questions of Marla, as many as we can. If you run out of cards, feel free to use any other kind of paper, or as the late Ray Magliozzi would say, I miss him so much. I can't remember if he was click or clack. You could always write it on the back of a $20 bill. So with that business out of the way, please join me in a very warm welcome for Dr. Marla Spivak.
Hi. Thank you so much, Ron, for having me, and thank you, everybody, for coming. This is a great venue. I'm in hell. Hell's Kitchen. That's great. And I recognize a lot of faces, and some of what I'll be talking about is familiar, but I hope to take it a little further. And I'll start with something really new, and it's just happening right now. Today, we're interviewing a new faculty person to study pollinator habitat, pollinator ecology. So we're looking for a new faculty member to study native bees and the habitat that they need. So we're on our third candidate, and we do one more this week. And it means so much to me because then I'll have help. And I have a lot of help, but another professor help. And another thing that's going on right now is yesterday, I got the schematic design for our new bee research lab that we're going to be building on campus. The state of Minnesota funded this, 2/3 funding. The college will fund it. Yeah. And the architectural firm that designed it, wait till you see it. I'm just going to say wait till you see it. We're going to have a groundbreaking ceremony sometime this summer. And of course, everybody's invited, and this is cool. It's really cool. Okay, so here we go. I don't know Laura Corcoran, and you might not be able to see her name, but she's the woman that did this drawing. And people send me things on occasion, and this woman, I've been using couple of her drawings. You'll see this one and another one later, repeatedly, because they so depict in visual, in art, exactly what I'm talking about. And the general theme, what I'm talking about, is something we call reconciliation ecology. And this is a way to put nature back in our human-dominated environment. So it used to be in ecology or in conservation programs, you'd buy up land and then you'd put them somewhere separate from where you were. So you'd buy up restored prairie, or you would restore a prairie out there somewhere. But now we're at the place where we want to combine it all. We're going to bring nature back into our human landscapes. And when we do that, we're going to bring back pollinators in there. And I promise they won't sting you, so don't worry about that. So the general concept that we're talking about is this beautiful term of reconciliation ecology. And of course, mostly what I study are honeybees, and I'm sorry that it's a little bit dark to see the fine detail in these, but they're not a native insect. We introduced honeybees into this world, into the New World, when we colonized North and South America. They're highly social. They're the only bee that produces honey. We have many other bees in Minnesota that are native. We estimate in Minnesota we have about over 400 species of native bees. And most of them are not social at all. They live in the ground, or they live in stems, or in just tunnels somewhere. And so yeah, honeybees, this one, Apis mellifera, is just one species, one kind of bee. And can you imagine there's 400 others? And so another thing that the state of Minnesota did that was just so amazing is help with funding to do surveys of all of these native bees for the first time, so that we can identify where they are, and we can compare them to historical collections in the museum to figure out if we're losing species, if we're maybe gaining species. I doubt it. And of course, the reason we care about bees is because they pollinate our fruits and vegetables. They pollinate our flowering plants, and so many of our flowering plants are fruit and vegetable plants. They pollinate our almonds in California. They pollinate coffee, where they grow coffee, which is important. They pollinate. Yeah, they pollinate sunflower oil, canola oil, those flowering oil seed crops, and many other things. So they're super important to our food. And they're important to Minnesota because it may be a surprise to you that Minnesota is always ranked the 5th or 6th honey producing state in the nation. So we produce a lot of honey up here per colony. This map shows you the states in yellow are states that produce a lot of honey. So California and Florida produce a lot of honey, but it's because they have a lot of beekeepers. But per colony, the most honey is produced in the upper Midwest, including Montana, which I guess is west, but in northern states. And it's because traditionally we've had a lot of honey-producing flowers like clover and alfalfa, our linden trees, our basswood trees in Minnesota, and many other plants that yield a lot of honey during the summer months. So beekeepers from all over the nation move their bees here and particularly North Dakota, actually, for the summer months to make honey. And then the arrows show what they move their colonies all over the United States to either pollinate crops or to produce more bees. But in the last years, we've been taking surveys because there have been huge losses of honeybees. And maybe you can see the red bars up at the top show the average losses of honeybee colonies from 2006, 2007 up to today, this last winter, or the previous winter. And they're averaging over 30%. This last winter was down at about just under 25%, which I'm hoping is good news, but we'll see if it's a trend this winter. And this loss, this 30% loss, is really not sustainable. Economically, for beekeepers, they can't take this much of a loss. The line down here that maybe you can see indicates what the acceptable range is, and this is through surveys. If you're a commercial beekeeper, you do this for a living, how many colonies can you lose over the winter and still make a profit? Basically, that's what it's saying. And that number ranges from about 15%. And when you get up to 30% loss, it's tough. The beekeepers then, to maintain the colonies, have to do these splits. They have to divide them, the surviving colonies, and raise a new queen bee, put a new queen bee in the split, and continue on that way. And it just puts a lot of demand on the beekeeping industry to keep the number of colonies up that we need to satisfy all the pollination contracts that we have to pollinate our fruits and vegetables all over the country. So it just puts a huge demand on them to keep the number of bees up. And we're at an all-time low in the United States. So this shows bee decline since World War II, since 1945, when we had about over 5 million hives of bees in the United States. And because they're managed and because we keep honeybees in boxes, we can get a fairly good count, kind of. Beekeepers don't like to tell you how many colonies of bees they have, but we can estimate. And we know at the end of 2007, we were at about 2 to 2.5, hives of bees in the United States. And we're just maintaining that number. We lose 30% every year, and the beekeepers have to recuperate their losses to bring them up, because we are at bare minimum number of hives to satisfy the pollination contracts that we have. One of the reasons we have so few colonies is because a parasite was introduced in the 1980s into the United States, kind of a long time ago now. But this is a blood-sucking parasite, and it only can live in honeybee colonies. Varroa destructor is its name. Looks like a little tick that it feeds on the blood of bees, circulates virus, huge problem. But generally, we've had that problem since 1987, and bee decline has really been noticeable since the winter of 2006, 2007. And so the reason we say, and I think most researchers across the nation agree now, that bees are really not dying from one single cause. It's not just these Varroa mites that I showed you in the previous slide. There's many things hitting them all at once. So those mites are a problem. Pesticides can be a problem. They are not the number one problem. Bees can't, of course, some kinds of pesticides are insecticides that are designed to kill insects. And so if any insect that runs into an insecticide is going to have a problem. That's what they're for. Beekeepers have tried to use some in-hive miticides, insecticides, to treat that Varroa mite. Sometimes the combination of that with the environmental insecticides has been problematic. Is this really in the way? Is this better? We shouldn't have put it there. Bees have diseases, and mostly what I'm going to talk about at the very bottom here is the lack of flowers. So bees eat flowers. You're about to eat dinner, and if you were all bees, you'd have flowers on your plate. And this is good timing. And so as they serve dinner, and those flowers, the protein part would be pollen, and the carbohydrate part would be the nectar that comes from flowers. And that's all they eat. They get all of their nutritional requirements from that. And nutrition is at the base of everything. So when bees have good nutrition, they're actually able to detoxify pesticides. And when they have good nutrition, their immune systems are bolstered. The good proper protein helps their immune systems fight off diseases. So I think the common denominator in this huge puzzle of problems that are afflicting bees right now, the common thing that we can help them with is giving them good nutrition. Does this sound familiar? It's kind of a human thing too. Okay, and as I said, and this is what you can't see is a bee in a flower, and she's getting all of her proper nutrition from nectar and pollen. And then, of course, bees need some water. Okay, so what you're seeing, maybe, can you actually see this from a little bit? Okay, is corn, wall-to-wall or road-to-road corn. And so some of the problems that bees are facing is a flowerless landscape. So bees, of course, corn sheds a lot of pollen for a short time in August when it's tasseling. And bees do collect corn pollen, but it's not very nutritious for bees. It's a wind-pollinated plant, and bees really prefer flowers that require an animal to move their pollen from flower to flower. And bees are the main, quote, animal, I guess they are an animal, that moves the pollen around. And so they're not getting a lot from corn, and they don't get anything from soybeans either. So unfortunately, a large portion of the Minnesota landscape is dominated by plants that bees cannot derive any nutrition from. And then on top of that, in our cities, we have huge expanses of lawns, which is right here. I blocked out this home because maybe you're here in the audience, I don't know. Actually, I like this particular lawn because the kids play on it all the time. And that's what a lawn should be for, is for use. But we have so many lawns that nobody ever walks on or does anything. The only person that is on the lawn ever is the guy that's maintaining the lawn with the mower, the power mower. He's applying herbicides and pesticides and all kinds of things, new fertilizers, to keep this lawn going that no one ever walks on. Another flowerless landscape. Insecticide use is a problem, not always, but there are many classes of insecticides. Most people are paying attention to this one up here. It says neonicotinoids. They're making the news right now because of the way they move through the plant tissue. They can move into the nectar and the pollen of the plant. But really, when you do surveys and you do residue analysis of what the bees are collecting in the pollen, in their protein, if you run that through a gas chromatograph and you look at the residue that's in the pollen, you'd very rarely even find the neonics, but you find everything else. So it's okay to pay attention to the neonics because it's like a gateway for the public to understand that that's one of many, many, many insecticides. And the other thing we need to understand about our insecticides is that, let me put it this way, if you go to the pharmacy, if you take an aspirin, or if you take any drug for yourself, the active ingredient will be labeled, and the inert ingredients will be labeled. But if you go to a pesticide label, only the active ingredient will be there. The inert ingredients are all proprietary information. They're not revealed, and some of these inactive, quote, inactive ingredients are actually more toxic than the active ingredient in some cases. So this is something that a little policy action might do a good thing of some labeling. That's a big undertaking, but herbicide use in recent years is way up, and a lot of it is due to the genetically modified plants, the Roundup-ready plants that we grow in our agricultural settings. The GM plants don't affect bees directly. That's not a problem for bees. They're fine with that. They're not hurt by GM plants, okay? Genetically modified. But what it allows us to do is apply a lot of herbicide on those plants so that it kills off all of the weedy flowers in the field without killing the crop, right? That's what they're for. But all of those weedy plants, many of those weedy plants are flowers that bees depend on for their food. And so the dramatic amount of herbicide use that we're using is actually killing off the food plants for bees in many locations. And so This is another one of Laura Corcoran's drawings, and a quote from a commercial beekeeper from North Dakota, actually, who put it better than I could ever have. He said, "Honeybees, wild bees, and other pollinators are reduced to feeding on scraps." That's kind of a sad state of affairs, and I think that sums it up very well. And as I said, I was getting to this labeling. We want all of our food labeled. We want to know all the ingredients. Don't you want to know what's in the food? Smells really good, by the way. I get to eat later. We want to know food label. We want to know what's in our food. We want to know if it's organic. We want to know if it's gluten-free. We want to know what's in our food. And I would argue that bees do too. Just like we want good, clean food, so do our bees. And they're actually very good at going to a flower and assessing the quality of the food in that flower. Does this flower have pollen? Does this flower have nectar? Is it a good quality? Their antennae and their tongues are very good at determining the nutritional quality of a flower. But I would argue that bees could use a little pesticide labeling on some of their flowers so that they could determine if it's contaminated or not. I'm going to move quickly into some of the research that we're doing now. That kind of outlines, I think, some of the bee problem in kind of big, broad strokes. And what you're looking at is all the people that work for me right now in the lab, and many of them are wearing beards of bees, which is not a requirement to work in the lab. Mostly what we study is bees' self-defenses. I'm really interested, and I have been since I've come to Minnesota, on how bees help themselves. So honeybee colony is highly social, and they have social health care. It's not a political thing. They're just insects, so they're not into that. But they do have social health care. They have individual immune systems, and as a colony of bees, they have what we call social immunity. And it's amazing some of the behaviors that they can do as a colony to defend themselves against diseases and parasites. And I'm interested in these. I've selected basic selection, breeding, basic bee breeding for bees that perform this behavior, which helps them. It's a genetic trait, and it allows the bees, when they have this genetic trait, they're able to sniff out little dead diseased baby bees in the nest, and they remove them from the nest, just like the immune system would detect a disease and destroy it. So the individual bees in the colony are acting like cells in the immune system when they're acting at the colony level. More recently, we're studying resin collection in bees. So many trees, in particular cottonwood, who knew? But we've just found out that cottonwood leaf buds secrete a lot of resin. And the resin, the bees collect it and they pack it on their hind legs, they take it home, and these resins are medicine. They don't eat them, but they use them to seal up cracks and crevices in the nest cavity. And we call it propolis or propolis. And humans have been using propolis in human medicine since antiquity, forever and ever. But no one ever studied the value of these resins, of the propolis, to the bees themselves. And so I've had several students get their PhDs determining that these plant resins help the bees' immunity, they help fight off diseases, and a simple one thing that we can do for the bees is to encourage them to deposit these resins in a nest cavity, and it's a kind of an easy fix. These are the students that have studied resin. Another student that just defended his PhD, his name is Matthew Smart, and now he's Dr. Smart. That's right. It's good, yeah. He studied the effects of our agricultural land use on the health and survivorship of honeybee colonies. And I'm not going to show you data because I'm going to blast through this stuff. But basically, what he developed, in essence, is a honeybee blood test. So now we know that we can go in and collect bees out of a colony and run them through a little test like you would have a cholesterol testing, for example, or blood glucose or something. For bees, we look at protein levels and lipid levels in their blood and their immune system. And we know that there's certain indicators that tell us that the bees are in a good environment nutritionally. There's a lot of, the more protein and lipids they have in their blood, we know the more flowers are out there in the landscape. And the level of these proteins and lipids predicts how long they'll live. So it was a very nice piece of work that he'll continue to investigate in other regions. In the same place where he studied the effects of agricultural landscapes on the health of honeybees, another student was doing surveys of all the native bees in the same area. So the same question, how do these agricultural landscapes affect our native bees, and what kind of landscapes do they need also? And she's not done with her thesis, so I just won't give you her results, but I know she's identified over 10,000 bees and over 200 species of bees, and it'll be very cool when she's got all her data analyzed. Another student, and this particular project is funded by the Minnesota Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund. Are you familiar with this? This is some of your lottery money goes into the Minnesota Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And it's administered by legislators at a citizen commission, and you can apply for money for research or education or other things like that. So I applied for money to study bee lawns. And I thought it was kind of whimsical, but fortunately people like the idea. So I have a student that's trying to determine, first of all, what kind of turf should we really be using? And it's a hard fescue rather than a Kentucky bluegrass, because it's better, it's northern adapted, you don't have to mow it as much, you don't have to water it as much. And what could we seed into that kind of fescue, that kind of turf, that could continue to flower so you can mow it and maintain it and manicure it like a lawn, but it would bloom, and that we could provide food for bees. And in this case, you wouldn't want to apply insecticides. And of course, these would be lawns that your kids are not necessarily playing on, or that you're playing soccer on. These would be areas where you're not walking on, that you could provide some bee pasture. So of course, you know that Dutch clover, the little white clover, is one of them that's very, very common. It used to be really common, not so much anymore, in our lawns. Of course, that's one of them. But what other flowers can we put in? What native flowers can we put in, seed into a lawn that you could mow and have it continue to bloom? So stay tuned for Ian's results. Another student, Judy Wu, who's married to Matt Smart. So now she's Judy Wu Smart. Very awesome graduate, a whole mess of awesome graduate students. She is actually looking at the effects of those neonicotinoid insecticides on queen honeybees and on queen bumblebees. Very different systems. So a honeybee colony is social all the time, and so the colony is kind of buffering the queen. She's in the middle. They feed her, and so are they able to buffer the effects of an insecticide on the queen? But the bumblebee queens are out there on their own in the spring. They hibernate all on their own underground, and they come out in the spring and feed on flowers to initiate a nest. And the sad news is that it affects both honeybee queens. If it gets into the honeybee queen, it affects how many eggs she'll lay. If a bumblebee queen comes out of the ground and feeds on flowers that are contaminated, it will either delay how quickly she can start a nest or prevent her from laying a nest at all. So Judy's work is funded by the EPA. They're doing they will be doing a re-registration of this class of insecticides in the next few years. They're waiting, and they're very dependent on the results of Judy's and other researchers' research like this. So she's very careful research that will be used by the government to register this class of compounds or to review their use. Another student who just finished also developed the very first honeybee cell culture. And so I always ask this, have any of you read the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? Yes, awesome book. And it describes how we developed the very first cell culture for humans. Well, he did it for honeybees, which means we can grow cells in the laboratory indefinitely over time. They'll be immortal. And we can identify ways to treat viruses that can only live within a honeybee cell. Very difficult to study when they're in the full organism. And so very interesting line of research. And then I'm getting toward the end before you throw me off the stage. In addition to all the research, we do a lot of what we call extension or outreach, or mostly what I call it is just help for the beekeeping industry as much as we can. There's a large commercial beekeeping industry in Minnesota. There are many, well, there's not many beekeepers in the nation, but there's probably a couple hundred commercial beekeepers in Minnesota. That means they have enough colonies to that's what they do for a living. And they have anywhere from 2,000 to 20,000 hives of bees that they maintain. And very hard for them to keep track of the diseases. So we started these teams called tech transfer teams. And one of my students goes around and helps the commercial beekeepers monitor the levels of diseases and mites they have in the pests they have in their colonies. They give them instant reports, like a doctor report right away, which really helps the beekeepers understand when they need to get things into control. They're also helping them with bee breeding efforts so we can breed for that hygienic behavior and other traits that will help the bees. And then finally, we have the BeeSquad program right here in town. And this is run by, oh, you can't see her, Captain Becky. So Becky was my first graduate student, actually, who went off, had another life, retired, came back, fortunately. And this is a program to help our many, many urban beekeepers. Many people would like to become backyard beekeepers, and it's a great thing, but they need a lot of help. And so we provide mentoring, and we provide also, we'll get more and more into it as we go, wild bee education. So you can call up the Bee Squad and get classes. We'll have one soon coming up on the bumblebees and on how you should plant bee-friendly flowers. We're hoping to team up with places like Master Gardeners and others that know a lot about how to do this planting so that we can help everybody in the city, Twin Cities area, help our pollinators. And one of the more amazing programs within the Bee Squad program is something we call Hive-to-Bottle, where you purchase the bees, but we're your beekeeper. So the Bee Squad actually maintains the bees for you. So there's a lot of homeowners that ask for our services, pay for our services, but then there's a lot of companies. And I want to just spend 1 minute on this because this has turned out to be something kind of beyond my wildest dreams. I hadn't really thought of this as we developed our business plan, but it just emerged from people wanting bees. So I'm going to go ahead and point out Town and Country Golf Club in St. Paul. They wanted a beehive. And then I will say that after they got their beehive, they wanted to treat a lot of their linden trees for Japanese beetle. And we said, whoa, watch out, because you might kill your own beehive that you just got. And it didn't kill their beehive, but that made them realize that, oh, whoa, wait a minute. So what are the bees eating? And what are our landscaping practices? And what can we do to not kill our beehive? And I think all of the companies on this list, and there's more and they're growing, are having beehives, just one beehive on the property, and starting to really, really think about their landscaping practices, both what should they plant for bees and what are they using for insecticides. It's a great public education thing that's happening. So I'm going to end here by saying everybody, of course, can help. Everybody, if you can, a little bit, anything would help. Plant some bee-friendly flowers. There's plant lists being developed all over Minnesota. Everybody's saying, so what are they? What are they? And we're trying to develop plant lists for everybody. But basically, I would say, when you go out to plant your plants and you go to a nursery, just stand there outside. When they have the nursery plants sitting outside, stand there. And if a bee lands on that plant, on the flower of that plant, buy that one. And that's the best way, because there's many, many, many varieties. Some are attractive to bees, some are not attractive. Even, for example, petunias. I'll just give that one. If you get an heirloom variety of a petunia, bees are going to love it. And a new variety, they may not. And there's so many that it's just so hard to come up with a plant list that it's just going to be up to you. And I think it would kind of be a great citizen science project to have everybody out there start looking at their nursery plants and making a big list and submitting them on a big website somewhere so that everybody could figure out which plants they should be buying, what varieties of which plants. And then, of course, the plants that you're putting out there for bee food, keep them clean. We don't have to do big bans on insecticides and pesticides. We don't have to change huge policy. We just need to get more bees out, more bee-friendly flowers out there and take care of those flowers. So I'm going to go through really quickly some ideas. Right now in our legislature, there's, I think, there is a bill in progress to put in buffer strips. This is the most amazing thing we could do, and please support this. Whoever is out there, whoever's listening, support this. There's a program in Iowa called the Strips Project. Go online, look up Strips, Iowa. And it's just planting native prairie strips. It helps prevent soil erosion into our waterways. It fixes the nitrogen. It brings in beneficial insects that help reduce the crop pests on the corn and soybeans. It increases yield for farmer just having these strips on there, and it provides flowers for our pollinators. It is a complete win-win-win. I mean, just win-win-win. Another thing is our Department of Natural Resources. Anytime we're restoring, or private people, anybody that's restoring a prairie, to put in more flowering plants would be very, very helpful. There are public programs through NRCS, our Natural Resource Conservation Service. There are incentives to put in flowering cover crops to help remediate our soil. So this is a really big program in Minnesota and in many of the upper Midwestern states. Our Department of Transportation is actively putting in flowers, native flowers, on some of our roadsides. The more we could do of this, the better. Here's another one right on I-94 in St. Paul, right by Hamlin neighborhood. And this red that maybe you can see is, what flower is that, you guys? Milkweed. And what do we need the milkweeds for? As our monarch butterflies. And so it's not just bees that we're talking about, it's our monarchs too, and they need big long corridors, and we can easily provide that for them. So it's a question of pollinators and pesticides. This is a balance, a new kind of balance we need to be thinking about. Instead of total eradication of everything, how do we do this wisely so that we can control our crop pests and support our pollinators? And I know we can do this. I know we can. So here's a plant list on our website. It's a very small one. It's just the beginning, beelab.umn.edu. But stay tuned, because the Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association is coming up with lists of lists for you. All right, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
So please pass those questions up here. I'm going to bring a couple chairs over here, Marla, so we can sit down for the Q&A part. But while we're waiting for some of the cards to come up, maybe I'll just start with this question. I remember the first time I heard you speak at Jenny Martin's house, and I asked the question, how much of this problem would go away if we just got rid of neonics? And you said, which surprised me, not so much. So the question is, when you think about people who care about bees and have educated themselves about bees, what are the 3 or 4 most important things you think that maybe they don't get yet?
Yeah. So I'm going to give these. So what don't people get? Well, one thing people don't get is that bees are not yellow jacket wasps. So yellow jackets are the insects that bother you when you're eating in August outside. And they're a wasp. And wasps are predators. They eat other insects and spiders, soft-bodied insects. And bees, as I said, eat pollen and nectar. But these yellow jackets, they're ground nesting. Everybody calls them bees. They give bees a really bad rap. They give them a bad name. They look kind of like bees, but they are not bees. And so one thing people can do is just learn to try to identify a bee from a wasp. Bees are really fuzzy. They collect pollen, they're little dust mops. And that's one thing. And the other one is just that I think it's, people tend to think that we need to eliminate all pesticides, and I don't think that's the case. We just need to be more judicious about our use, and we need to be choosing ones that are not necessarily so toxic. We don't need to do chemotherapy on the whole environment. We can basically, we can just use it where needed and how needed, and protect pollinators at the same time.
Okay, here's one from right down front. Honeybees are an invasive species. What do they do to our native species?
Okay, so this word invasive, honeybees are an invasive species. Invasive just means they're able to move and propagate themselves a lot. That when you put the judgment on the word invasive, it means you don't like them when they do that. But okay, I'm going to say it. We're the #1 invasive species, so okay. So given that, honeybees are not very invasive because they only go where we take them, basically. But actually, honeybees, there is no evidence that a honeybee has ever outcompeted a native bee to drive them to extinction. There's no evidence for this. Sometimes they fight over who gets what flowers. But as far as impacting the reproductive success or whether the native bee can continue to reproduce, there's very, very little evidence, if no evidence for that. So we need all of our bees. We really do need all of them.
This question has a couple of parts. Is any research being done about sublethal doses of ag chemicals, and I trust that means other than pesticides, besides what you've talked about already? Who funds bee research? And finally, this is very specific. What do we do to control tarnish plant bugs? Spotted wings Drosophila,
Yeah.
isn't that a fruit fly?
Yeah.
In you-pick strawberry fields.
Wow. That was a good. So what was the first one? Sublethal effects. So sublethal effects are incredibly important to study, and finally our EPA is saying, yes, we need to study these sublethal effects. So a direct acute effect is you get an insecticide, you die. A sublethal effect is you get a little bit of a dose that maybe intoxicate a bee or disorient a bee, but then if that bee never makes it home, then that spins off. It has downstream effects on the health of the colony, or that if a native bee, one little bee gets a little drunk out there or intoxicated by an insecticide, she can't find her way back to feed her little baby, then there's downstream effects. So yes, there is a lot of research going on, and Judy Wu, my student, is doing some of that. I forget the middle question.
Who funds the research?
Who funds the research? It goes all the way from National Science Foundation to the USDA is funding a lot of research. More regionally, we can get funding from Sustainable Ag Research and Education. It's a division of USDA. Minnesota State is amazing in their funding of bee research through the Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund. Very, very good. And then the beekeepers are funding research. I'm forgetting places. There's a National Honey Board. There's the Almond Board that's funding research. And then finally, what can we do about spotted winged Drosophila?
And tarnish plant bugs.
Call my colleague Chris Phillips, who's a new professor who will be studying this and their effects on raspberries and strawberries. Very horrible pest of our berries. And I don't know the answer to that question. Do you have to ask Chris?
What technologies are you studying to ease overwinter stresses? Heaters, insulation, hive design, etc.
Right. So the question is, how are we helping our bees get through the winter months? And so if you're a backyard beekeeper, you just leave your bees in your backyard for the whole winter. And we are looking at a different kind of insulation wraps that you can put around a honeybee colony in the wintertime that would maybe help them. They didn't used to need these things, but now the health of our colonies throughout the United States is kind of diminished. They're not as healthy as they used to be. So Gary Reuter, my technician, and I started an experiment last fall where we used some wraps with high insulation value that we got from Canada. And stay tuned because we'll find out this spring how they did.
Here's one that goes back to basics. Of the 400 native species of bees in Minnesota, how many are pollinators?
All of them. Bees are pollinators, and the reason they are is because they need pollen for food. So they go from flower to flower picking up pollen for food, and they end up transferring that pollen from flower to flower. And pollination just happens. So that's why bees are the most important pollinators, is because they need the pollen to eat. And they like, once they're on aster pollen for the day, that if they find a plant, let's say it's an aster, bees love asters or sedum or something, they're going to stay on aster for that foraging trip and then end up moving pollen from aster to aster to aster, or from apple to apple to apple. Or dandelion to dandelion.
Well, and that makes me want to stay on that question for a minute, maybe broaden it a bit, because I know you're on the board of the Xerces Society, too. I heard one of their officers describe it. This is an outfit that's devoted to preservation of invertebrates of all kinds. I heard Eric Motter call it the largest and most important conservation organization in the world that nobody's ever heard of. But if we look beyond bees for a moment, can you say a little bit about your insights on other pollinator health, invertebrates and birds for that matter, bats?
Right. So the other pollinators are some butterflies, and of course monarchs are seriously in trouble. Bumblebees, there are some species of bumblebees that should be red listed. They're really going extinct, which is really, really sad. Then there's other, here you go. Birds like hummingbirds are pollinators. As they go into flowers, they end up picking a little bit of pollen on their beak and then moving from flower to feed. And I don't know if there's any information on the hummingbirds. Bats can be pollinators at night, flower feeding bats. And of course, bats are having other problems with white nose fungal disease. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, I think so.
Xerces Society is, we'll just put a plug for Xerces. It's XERCES. And if you go on their website, you can get all kinds of information on planting in your region, what flowers you should plant, how to do it. They provide help to farmers on putting flowers in. So they're really, really an amazing organization. Thanks for bringing that up.
This is going back, I think, to your really interesting slide about social immunity. The question is, do you see a parallel between herd immunity, with measles being an example, and the protections within the bee colonies?
Right. Yes. All of those kind of veterinary medicine, livestock medicine, or human medicine principles apply to a honeybee colony. So if you can get the pathogen level down enough, which is what vaccinations are about, or herd immunity is all about, then there's less disease transmission within a colony and between colonies. So yes, the same principles apply. It's a fascinating area of study.
Moving over into the policy and maybe politics realm for a moment, are there any legislative efforts at the state level, I think this means, that we should be aware of and support?
Yeah. Yes, actually I've been really busy with helping hire this new professor and the new Bee Lab architectural plans that I'm not I'm not as in tune, but Erin Rupp is. And Erin, stand up again. So this is Erin, and she's working very, very closely with our legislators and people on all of the issues. And one of them are these buffer strips, right, Erin?
Yeah, there's a hearing tomorrow.
Hearing tomorrow. Show up. So I would encourage you to talk to Erin because she's really, thank you very much for her efforts. It's great that there's people out there able to do this for us.
And maybe this is a parallel question. Have you tried to partner with the Met Council, or maybe do you know of things that the Met Council is interested in that would improve the pollinator friendliness in local government comprehensive plans?
Well, not directly working with the Met Council, but if the Bee Squad might be, because Becky Masterman, the director of my Bee Squad, is really energetic and really doing a lot of things, and she keeps me up to date, and I realize that I'm not keeping up with Becky a lot of the times. One of the things that we're exploring in St. Paul are community apiaries, like you would have community gardens, locations where a number of beekeepers could keep their bees in one location and then get help from each other or help from a professional. I think there's a lot of initiatives to be planting flowers. This came down as a presidential initiative, actually, so don't have a great answer for that one.
This question wants to take us back to the STRIPS program, which was that the Iowa Highway Project. How do the strips work if the fields on either side of the strips are being sprayed with pesticides?
Right, so this STRIPS project is kind of new to me too, and I need to be able to have the time to go and look on their website and look at all of the data that they've produced down in Iowa. But my understanding was most of them were a cornfield, a strip, and then riparian area, so a river or water, some kind of waterway. So I think that's when they would really benefit. But I do think they have research where it strips between corn or between corn and soybean. And if it's wide enough, they must have researched how wide it must need to be to bring in enough beneficial insects that help reduce the crop pests on the corn and the soybeans that are getting rid of some of the soybean aphids, some of the parasites that can eliminate the soybean aphids. Or, corn rootworm's a problem again now on corn, and I'm not sure. But I really, all of us need to go online and look at that program and study it because I've heard nothing but good things about it.
And this is going to remind me of a question that came into Earth Journal after I wrote about your talk at the Environmental Initiative program a few months ago. And the question was, how can it be good for bees to be planting forage territory next to a strip of asphalt carrying huge steel objects at 80 miles an hour? Is it putting bees in danger by moving them near roadways?
Bees don't really cross the road. If you provide enough flowers on one side, they're going to hang out right there. So I wouldn't worry about it. I really wouldn't worry about it. More, it's the pollutants from the cars that might get on the flowers that are the bigger problem rather than the cars per se. So the roadsides, you have to be really careful about when you're doing roadside planting. So maybe it's not that 8-foot strip that we need to mow for safety reasons. Maybe it's 8 feet in where it's more flowers so that that's far enough away, the bees would stay back there and be a little farther away from the pollutants.
Well, now I guess I want to follow up on that too, because I've heard you address this a couple times. It never fails to amaze me. It might amaze some people here to say a little bit about what the foraging territory of bees is, what the extent is that they.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. A honeybee colony on an average foraging trip when a honeybee colony leaves her colony and goes out shopping is 2 miles. So a 2-mile radius around a honeybee colony is 8,000 acres. So that's their territory. So a lot of people think, I'll plant a few flowers in my backyard, I'll get a beehive. And no, they're taking the city basically or an area. Our native bees fly generally under half a mile, so their foraging range is a lot less. They're much more localized. So yes, for your native bees, you can plant enough for them, and they really like places without mulch. so they can get into the ground and nest. Sorry.
The program at SeaTac Airport seems interesting. Could that be replicated elsewhere, and what can be done to support it?
Yeah, so the program in Seattle Airport, I just met those people, and it's our Minneapolis airport. Our airport here is very interested in getting some bees, and we're working with them on. Actually, Becky Masterman from the Bee Squad is working with them on using the airport location as a site where we could start a bee and veteran program. This is a program we really want to get started so that we can be working with veterans to help them become beekeepers. Beekeeping is a very meditative thing. You have to be pretty calm when you're keeping bees because the bees let you know when you're not. And the airport locations, they have a lot of land. They can do a lot of planting. The planes don't interfere with them. So this is what we're going to be working on here. I think it has potential, and we're working on it right now.
We're going to have time for some more if you want to pass questions up. I'm going to save this one for last, I guess. Oh, no, it's just a great exit question. Oh. Can a bee pasture be accommodated on a golf course property or other plantings that are bee friendly if pasture is too intense? Somebody here who doesn't want to have to hit out of the forbs. Oh.
Yeah, that's all right. So planting flowers in the roughs is a great idea. You know, you don't want them on your greens. It interfere with your golf game, I think. My dad was a big golfer. I don't know anything about it. But flowers in the roughs are fine, and they'd be pretty.
How can we become part of a community beekeeper program? I think you have the answer for that.
Yeah. So yeah, look at our website for the Bee Squad and get in touch with the Bee Squad program, because the city of St. Paul is very interested, like I said, in these community gardens. We have to work out how you do this, and community apiaries, locations where you keep bees. And I'll just give you a real quick reason why it's not so easy is because, okay, how many of you out there are beekeepers? How many in this crowd are beekeepers, right? And I can't see very well, but every beekeeper has the best way to keep bees. It's just part of beekeeping. And so if you have a community apiary and there's 10 people with 10 colonies, everybody's got the best way to do it. And so we would have to have some kind of understanding about how we're going to keep our bees, because there are diseases and pests, and if one person wants to treat and the other one wants to be a treatment-free beekeeper, they put the other colonies at risk. It goes back to that herd immunity question. How do we maintain the health of this particular apiary? So it's a great idea. It's a little more complicated than we thought, because we would have to come up with some guidelines for how to keep your bees healthy in those particular locations. But I think it's a really, really good idea. This guy has another question out here. He's raising his hand.
Okay. John? Jim?
What birds are known as predators where bees are concerned?
What birds are known as predators on bees?
Where bees are concerned.
Where bees are concerned.
People have a lot of bird feeders, and I just wondered.
Are bird feeders a problem?
So birds don't really bother bees, but little biology. Male bees don't sting. They don't have a stinger. And so there's some bees that only eat male bees because they don't want to get stung, right? So kingfishers eat male bees, and they're about the only ones that I really know of. So there's some skunks. That's not a bird, but skunks can eat bees. Bears love bees, but birds not really a problem.
So other than a few birds and bears and Varroa mites, are there other predators? No, No other predators on bees. That's interesting. People. Well, we have a little impact. What organizations or companies are helping to build bee habitat? Who can help me change my lawn?
I will say one of the companies in Minnesota that was first to jump on this was General Mills. Very big supporters of bees. The whole General Mills, not just the organic division, Cascadian Farm, but General Mills, very big supporters. Target, Aveda. Aveda is huge supporter of bees. I can't even remember all of them that are on that list that have a beehive. All of them are very big supporters. And the other one was what do I do? Who can help me put bee habitat in my yard? This is what we need. We really need a statewide or a citywide, or begin it somehow, plant squad. So planting for pollinators is a new thing. We've had butterfly gardens, we've had rain gardens, but we don't have pollinator garden recommendations. We know that most of the native plants, the native perennials, will be really good for our native bees. They'll also be good for our honeybees, some of them. And we know that some of our annual bedding plants are not at all attractive to bees. So, like I said, coming up with these plant lists is really, really hard. We're at the really early stages of it. It's going to be a great big project, and I think everybody can help. So how do you do it? You can call any of the native plant nurseries. I probably shouldn't make recommendations, but Prairie Moon, Prairie Resto, Minnesota Native Landscapes, all of them can help you put in native prairie habitat. And I think a lot of the garden centers and master gardeners could give good recommendations on plants that they know would be bee friendly.
Sure, go ahead, just speak up.
How are Africanized honeybees affecting everything? Do they survive better? Are they tougher? And when hives come up south, do some come with?
I'll just say this for the tape. This is actually an area of your past research, Africanized honeybees. Let's talk about the problems they cause and what can be done about them.
Okay. So Africanized honeybees got the bad name of killer bees. So that's what we're talking about. And yeah, I did my PhD research on these bees. So they're a tropical bee. They were introduced from Africa into South America first because we brought in European-derived bees into South America where they didn't do so well in the tropics. They're from Europe. They didn't do well in the tropics. And the state and the country of Brazil said, why do we have European-derived bees? Let's bring in bees from Africa where they're tropically adapted, and it did make a lot of sense, but they ended up bringing bees over that kind of had an attitude. And not all the bees from Africa have an attitude, but these did, and so they very good at defending their nest, and people like to call that aggression, but it's actually defense. They're very, very good at defending the nest. So as a beekeeper, you try to go to open the colony and they stage a really impressive defense. Hard to keep them as a bee colony, and you can't keep them in your backyard, for example. They are a tropical bee, and so they are confined to, they moved through South America, Central America, Mexico, but they're confined to parts of Texas and a little bit of New Mexico, southern Arizona, and they're really at the edge of their climatic range. They cannot move up further north, and they won't. And they're not moving east either into Mississippi or Louisiana. It's too wet, too much pine forest. So beekeepers that have bees down there are not bringing them up here. People that are selling queen bees are not selling them from those areas. So big hype, they're kind of petered out at the edge of their range, their climatic range, and don't worry about them.
This is from Dylan, who's 11 years old. You mentioned some crops for which bees are important pollinators. He just wants to know more about flowers and fruits that pollinators pollinate.
Right, so that's Dylan, where are you? Oh, there he is, way in the back. Hi. How many of the fruits and vegetables? So all the apples, and so that would also include pears because they're in the same family. Almost all of the berries, so blackberry, raspberry, strawberry, blueberries, cranberries. Cranberries are actually a native plant, as are blueberries. So honeybees can pollinate them, but our native bees, bumblebees in particular, really prefer to pollinate cranberries and blueberries along with some of our other native bees. All the vine crops like squash, cucumber, pumpkins, help me out, you guys. Watermelon, zucchini, thank you. And then some of the others. So when you buy vegetable seeds, so when you go plant your garden and you plant these seeds, where do these seeds come from? A lot of them come from Oregon, where they grow a lot of vegetable seed, onion seed, carrot seed, radish seed, all these seeds that you plant in your garden. A lot of them are due because they had honeybees out there to help pollinate that plant so that it would set seed. And then flower seeds too. I forgot all of the brassica family, so all of the broccoli and cauliflower and kale and et cetera, et cetera.
I'm remembering the Whole Foods demo. Didn't they take about 40% of their fruits and vegetables off the display one day to demonstrate what would be gone if we lost honeybee pollinators? 30% of our diet. We haven't really talked about colony collapse disorder much, but you have interesting views on this that I think might be a surprise to some people. Let me preface the question, I guess, by saying that the shorthand understanding that you see in most news reports is that in the winter of 2006, 2007, all of a sudden we had this thing emerge where beehives were emptying and the bees were never found again. The colony was gone and nothing could be done. And I think many people assumed it was just one thing, and the one thing was neonicotinoid pesticides. But tell us what that doesn't cover that's important and true.
So, yeah, it's interesting history. There was one beekeeper in Pennsylvania, a migratory beekeeper, meaning he's moved his bees all over the nation pollinating crops. He noticed that his bees, he'd go into a colony and open it up and it looked healthy, and then he'd do the rounds, and by the time he'd get back to that location where that colonies or those colonies were, he'd open it up and there were no bees in there. And he'd see all the food stores were in there, the queen bee was in there, but all the adult bees had vacated, they were gone, and they didn't, in a typical pesticide kill, you'd find the dead bees right in front of the colony. That's how they die. But in this case, the bees weren't anywhere to be found. And so we had no idea what was going on. We called it colony collapse disorder. And then research started happening and surveys, national surveys started, we started taking a lot of national surveys. And since that time, we found that actually a very small proportion of colonies that are dying from those particular symptoms. It happens, but the majority of colonies are dying from many, many reasons. From the mites, from bad nutrition, from not enough honey, from pesticide, very few actually are being killed from pesticide kills, surprisingly. But from many different reasons, mostly diseases and pests, and then all of these interactions that seem to be happening. We can't really identify any one cause. But this rapid disappearance of bees from a colony and evacuation of bees does happen, but not at all frequently.
And that makes me think of the issue of supplemental feeding that commercial beekeepers have adopted in feeding bees sugar water, basically, to make up for the lack of natural forage, whether that's a factor. And it also makes me think of an observation I've heard you make, that a big problem for us is not just that we're losing commercial honeybees, but we're losing commercial beekeepers as they age out. And can you talk about that?
Sure. So I'll first talk about the supplementary feed. So it is true that beekeepers commercial beekeepers and backyard beekeepers, there's times a year when you may need to give your colony supplementary food. And the food that has been available commercially for bees was developed over the last 50 years or so, and it involves either sugar syrup, which actually isn't bad at all for bees, and then high fructose corn syrup. And now we're learning that the high fructose corn syrup is really not that good for a bee colony. It's missing a lot of the nutrients within the nectar that they would get from flowers. And then we also feed them supplementary protein at times. And because of the bee die-offs that we're seeing, many researchers are really starting to look in, okay, we got to get, if we have to give our bees supplementary food at some times, let's give them things that are more aligned with what bees eat naturally instead of these supplementary proteins. So I think in the next 5 years, in fact, Purina here is Purina based in Land O'Lakes? Am I confusing that? Anyway, Purina just put out a big job description. They're looking for a researcher to study a better bee food. Okay, this is going to happen, and it's going to happen fairly soon, and it's going to be derived more on plant pollen and natural ingredients that they eat naturally. So I think we're going to see a good revolution coming up in bee feeding. And then your second question was, sorry, I can't remember.
Beekeepers.
Oh, beekeepers, yeah. Beekeeping is a really hard way to make a living. And beekeepers they're my, okay, don't take offense, but they're my favorite people, really. They're really interesting people. They really prefer to be out with their bees. Have you ever seen the movie Yuli's Gold? It was with Peter Fonda. If you haven't seen it, go on Netflix, download Yuli's Gold, and then you'll get an idea of what a beekeeper is like. Really not people. They prefer to be with their bees out in the country somewhere. And they're an aging community. Those that are commercial beekeepers are really aging, and like our farms, not necessarily replaced with younger people. There are a lot of new hobby beekeepers, backyard beekeepers, but those going into it for a living are fewer and fewer. And this is problematic if we want to pollinate our food, our fruits and vegetable crops. We're going to need those beekeepers that can move sufficient number of colonies into the almond orchards or the blueberry fields or the cranberry bogs or the pumpkin patches to pollinate all of the fruits and vegetables that we need. It's a very important occupation, and they're really unsung heroes, those beekeepers.
They've had very hard times. So here's the question I saved for last. What research hasn't been done yet that is on your wish list?
I actually have a big wish list, but I'll hit the top one. So what I would really like to get back into is breeding bees, and I think that as there is a local food movement, we can do local bee breeding. We can produce bees regionally, even up in this cold climate. There is ways to do that, and we could be producing our bees here instead of depending on bringing bees from other parts of the nation. I think we can bring our mite and pest levels down if we can do this kind of regional thing. So as I think about moving into the retirement phase of my career, which is not going to happen too soon, but this is how I want to go out, if you will, is with the local bee breeders.
Marla, thank you so much. It was just terrific. And thank you all for coming.